I'm just going to wait a second more to see if we have more attendees come on. I know that it is a time when people are gathering after maybe perhaps a break. Um, and you have had a full and wonderful conference already. My name is Sonia Waters, and I'm really excited to be able to spend this time with you tonight. Talking about spirituality, talking about spiritual practices as a part of mental health care. And I'm honored also to be a part of Harvest of Hope. Anything that I can do to support NAMI in its mission, I'm delighted to do so. And NAMI is an organization that's helped so many people and has been a source of light and hope for them. And so I'm definitely delighted to be able to be a part of that. So let me just begin as people are coming in to let you know a little bit about myself. I'm Sonia Waters. I'm a professor at Princeton Seminary in Princeton, New Jersey, and I teach pastoral care. So the work I do is basically psychology and religion kind of work. My degree is in pastoral theology, but I also have experience in a multi-faith chaplaincy, both disaster chaplaincy, as well as hospital chaplaincy, and a little bit of experience also at Carrier Clinic, which is down the street from us here at Princeton. I'm working with the chaplain Stephen Faller, who's a great mentor on issues of mental illness and spirituality. Addictions is the topic I tend to write about, but I also teach a course on the basics of mental illness or DSM-5 diagnoses for seminarians as well. So with all that, I am delighted to be with you tonight. And as a psychology of religion kind of person, I've always been interested in how spiritual practices can really help to ground us, can help with emotional wellness, can provide structure, something that we can return to every day, as well as help provide meaning and hope for all of the changes and chances of our lives. So I want to say right in the beginning that I know that there are a diversity of people represented at NAMI, and there may be people here who live with mental health conditions themselves, as well as support loved ones who do. And I also know there are many beliefs represented here. And so I'm hoping to offer you a lot of themes and ideas to see what speaks to you at this point in your life and this point in your own spiritual quest. And so as I often tell my students, take what works for you and then leave the rest behind. I'm hoping to be able to offer some touchstones for you to think about what spiritual practices and also spirituality might look like for you. So my hope first is to mention the possibility, which is a little bit controversial, but the possibility that mental health conditions themselves are a part of a spiritual quest. That may or may not appeal to you. It does not negate the suffering involved in them or the ways that they are genetically or neurobiologically involved, but that in all of our lives, all of our experiences are a part of our spiritual quest. So I want to start a little bit with that. And then I want to frame some sources of spiritual practices to get some feel for the possibilities of what might work for you in your own exploration. And third, I want to focus on some of the benefits of a handful of spiritual practices that tend to support emotional functioning. So I'll talk for a little bit about spirituality in general, a little bit about where we find sources of spiritual practices, and then I'll open it up for questions, and we'll talk some more about some specific spiritual practices, and then we can have some more questions then as well. Most specifically for spiritual practices, I'll be looking at meditations like mindfulness or loving kindness meditations or mantra kind of prayers, and also the use of rituals, the use of anniversary rituals and marking time through rituals. Now, there has been lots and lots of research on spirituality and mental health. And so I want to give you one basic literature review to show you its benefits. So 1 second, and I'm going to figure out how to share my screen with you. And here we go. So spirituality and mental health care. There have been tons and tons of studies about spirituality and mental health care. I mean, this is a review of some of its benefits. That spirituality strengthens a sense of self and self-esteem. It helps people feel more like a whole person, not just defined by a disease or by a struggle or by a traumatic experience. It helps people feel valued, either by the divine as they understand it, of a creation, or as child of God. Um, Spirituality also counters stigma and shame by positive self-attributions. It gives us a sense of identity, and sometimes it gives us meaning in a community. And so through all of this, it reinforces personhood. When we think about person-centered care, that people are more than their conditions, but they are a whole person, beloved and full of gifts to offer the world. So it reinforces a personhood understanding of mental health conditions. Spirituality is also associated with decreased levels of depression. That's among people with intrinsic spirituality or beliefs. And so the idea about intrinsic or extrinsic would mean extrinsic would be sort of going to church or temple or mosque because that's what you do without a lot of a sense of internalizing it. While intrinsic spirituality or religious beliefs are about things we internalize. Lower levels of general anxiety, also positive outcomes in coping with anxiety has been found in those who use positive religious coping. And the utilization of positive religious coping, this is the work of Harold Koenig and also the work of Kenneth Pargament. Positive religious coping can be anything from joining with a divine person or a community or a belief towards healing, or a positive reappraisal of one's condition, what is the good in it as well as the bad, as well as a source of comfort and a source of strength. These are positive religious coping ideas. Religion and spirituality also delivers social and community resources. So we know that belonging to a religious community, we can find acceptance. We might find a strength in its ritual, and that might have special importance for people who are often rejected, isolated, or stigmatized. But it can also be the case that environments that we might sort of in our binary thinking imagine are secular, such as support groups or groups where people can gather to spend the day together, or a place like NAMI can also offer a spiritual comfort because we're gathering together in a group for love and support, understanding, and learning. So these are some of the strengths that spirituality offers. But already we have this vague term, right? What is spiritual after all? Well, imagine that spirituality includes some particular aspects of our lives. It can include a search for meaning in life, where we seek to discover our highest values, or we're committed to a cause, or a quest for transformation of self or society. So spirituality can be lived through a search for meaning in life. It can also be an encounter with transcendence, and this does not have to be a religious transcendence, but it can be through a sense of the divine. It can be through a larger community, again, as I mentioned, who gather. Also, we can find it in seeking sacred people like healers or bodhisattvas or saints. We can find it in a connection with nature, or a mountaintop experience, a sudden feeling of connection and euphoria, and that we're part of something bigger than ourselves. Spirituality can also include practicing a philosophy for living. So it can be grounded practices like meditation, or like living a life in tune with your values or your big beliefs about the world. So, for instance, Buddhism has the Four Noble Truths that might um, uh, help one live one's lives better, or Ayurvedic principles of health that help one make decisions about one's health in a different way. So, spirituality then can include all of these things. So, with that, let me talk a little bit about that first thing I was going to talk about. If we have this definition of spirituality, then is it possible that all our lives are a spiritual quest, a way of growing spiritually in mind, body, and spirit? So this might not appeal to you, or it might, but I believe that our lives in their messiness, in the midst even of suffering, are themselves always a spiritual quest. So spirituality is not about tidying things up. Society often treats people who suffer mental health conditions as a kind of problem, as something that must be fixed. But every individual is always a spiritual being. So I don't mean this in a sentimental or a saccharine kind of way, or that it excuses suffering in any way. But what I mean is that we don't live out spirituality in an ideal space above our lives, outside of the deep realities of our challenges as well as our joys. So the spiritual quest is the struggle to find meaning and transformation in the midst of our lives, however you're experiencing it right now. We find this both personally, but it's also in how we fight unjust systems and stigma in the midst of these conditions, or how we support others, how we find moments of transcendence or connection, or hard-won knowledge that seems to deepen our values as we live them out. And there are also people who believe that their mental health conditions are a deep part of their spiritual realities, that they have something to offer spiritual growth. So one of the founding figures of hospital chaplaincy, if you've ever been in hospital and a chaplain stopped by your room, but one of the founding figures of the hospital chaplaincy movement actually suffered from schizophrenia. His name was Anton Boysen. And he believed that reflecting back on what he referred to as his mental breakdowns had something to teach him about God and about the spiritual life. Now, there were opportunities to reflect as well as to grow in wisdom. So if spirituality is how we respond to our lives through our values, through our desire for transformation or transcendence, then I'd suggest also that being here at a conference, being involved in NAMI and what it has to offer, seeking community and knowledge and hope is itself a spiritual quest. And as you also reach out to each other, as you also seek to transform your community, that indeed is a very powerful spiritual quest. So we come together to support each other. And when we do that, we're already engaging in something that's bigger than ourselves. We're seeking to express what we value in life. And this is a part of what it means to live out our spirituality. So we can continue to talk about that too. But I want to turn to how we come up with spiritual practices. So when you are thinking about your own life, and when you're thinking about your challenges or your anxieties, your griefs as well as your hopes, what spiritual practices might sustain, strengthen, comfort, or help you in that work? So I'm going to return to the slides as I get wonderfully technical here. Here we go. So again, spirituality, a search for meaning, an encounter with transcendence, and practices that live out our philosophies, I would suggest, happens in the middle of our real and messy lives. Their struggles and triumphs and joys, and not apart from them. So if that is the case, then, with these three aspects of spirituality in mind, what are spiritual practices? Well, I would suggest two things. Spiritual practices are what moves us towards what is bigger than ourselves, and also what grounds us in the present moment. These seem very different, but you'll find in all historic faith traditions that both of these are in play. So, what moves us towards what is bigger than ourselves? We're thinking about a connection with something transcendent or expansive, or something we consider sacred or of ultimate value, whether it's persons, ideals, nature, a figure of divinity, or a calling in your life. When we think about what grounds us in the present moment, it's what centers us in our bodies, what settles down what is sometimes called our monkey minds, or what opens us to love others without fear, to manage what it's like to live in this present moment with all its difficulties and all its joys. So already I hope you see some benefit in both transcendence and grounding, both if you're living with a mental health condition or trying to support a loved one. There is so much out of our control. And spiritual practices are not a solution to all of our problems, but they can help us find a center in the storm. They can help us mark time meaningfully with ritual or meditation or prayer practices. And they can help us manage difficult mood states when those moods seem to become us instead of being felt by us. And it can help us when we become feeling overwhelmed, to imagine ourselves as part of a bigger whole and to reach out to others for support. So when thinking about religious practices that you might need right now, we can begin by asking ourselves some questions. You can ask, what do I need right now? Do I need to get out of myself? Am I full of anxieties and worries right now? Do I need to get out of my isolation? Does caring for others or for myself tend to isolate me and it's hard to reach out? Or in psychological terms, do I need to be held by something bigger than myself? Life is draining. Life is exhausting. Sometimes I want to rest in something bigger than myself. Or do I need guidance from my community? So all of those are questions about something transcendent. Looking for spiritual practices that get you in touch with a connection to something that is expansive, something bigger than you. But maybe you feel a little bit differently. Maybe your mind is overwhelming you with anxieties to the extent that it's hard to calm it down with thoughts of the future. Maybe you struggle with a sense of helplessness or difficult feelings that are hard to feel or process or let go of. And then the question is, do I need to somehow sit in the present moment and ground myself? Maybe get a balance between what's going on in my head and what is my real present moment. Do I need to help breathe through some difficult times? Or am I exhausted and I need to get it back in touch with my body and care for it and nourish it in some way? Well, that is number two, what grounds us in the present moment. Right? So where do we get these practices from? Well, I'm going to talk about these practices in connection with historic faith traditions, because even if you are a spiritual seeker and not a part of an historic faith tradition, what we can find is they can offer us some guidelines or some options that we can then think about when we're thinking about our own spirituality. But also, if you are part of a historic tradition, there's ways for you to bring those practices more deeply into your work as a spiritual seeker. So even if you are part of a historic tradition, but you're feeling like it's not feeding you right now, there's ways to connect it to your life experience. So let's talk about some of those. First of all, when I'm thinking about drawing from spirituality and religion, this is kind of a good basic diagram for what I'm talking about. Spirituality, where do I find meaning, feel connected, how should I live? And these are the big questions we ask, regardless of whether or not we're from a particular faith tradition. And then religion offers practices, rites, rituals. It can help us with our ethical decisions. It can guide us ethically. And it can help us hold on to our values, what is true or false. And in between those, we get belief, comfort, reflection, ethics, and hopefully every once in a while, some awe as well. So with that in mind, then, one thing that historic faith traditions offer us are practices that seek to reorient us either to the divine or to our bodies in time. For instance, they all have practices of self-examination or return. Well, actually, self-examination and return. You have to examine first, and then you return. So usually these are seasonal. For instance, Ramadan in the Islamic faith, Lent in the Christian faith, or Yom Kippur in the Jewish faith. And so then a question for you would be, what would a process of self-examination and recommitment or return look like for you? For each of these faith traditions, it's a good amount of time of self-examination. So you're spending weeks in reflection. You're spending weeks perhaps giving something up for all of these traditions. And then you might want to think about what it means to recommit or return. Confession is also involved in these traditions. So that's part of self-examination. So if you're from one of these traditions, how can these feed your reflection now? But if you are not, what in general would self-examination and return look like for you? There are also times of renewal and celebration that historic faith traditions offer, like Diwali, which is celebrated by Sikhs, Jain, and Hindus, or the Jewish celebration of Rosh Hashanah. So these are New Year's celebrations. They have joy in them, but also a sense of turning or change, times of hope, times when we look back on a season and look forward to a season that's coming. So what would a New Year's ritual look like for you? For me, I'm in 12-step recovery. And so I go to a monastery over New Year's Eve, the secular New Year's Eve, and I work on 12-step work. So I don't go there really for monastic work. I go there for 12-step work, and I recommit myself to my spiritual path of recovery. And so are there times of recommitment for you in your life that you're longing for? And what might be a ritual that might help bring those alive for you? Most traditions also have prayer and meditation practices, both to connect to divine people or places or to center the self. Some of these practices are very popular actually as therapeutic modalities these days. Currently, mental health practitioners are very interested in practices like yoga, mindfulness meditation, loving kindness meditation, that are used to help center the body and the mind and to help us to experience our states of thinking and feeling non-judgmentally. But prayer practices can also be traditional prayer practices. They can be from your particular tradition, or they can be in general to a higher power or to a place. I know people who talk on nature walks to nature. So there are many ways that we can offer our intentions aloud to the universe. So second, historic beliefs or historic religions take the person beyond the self in some way. And this can be that transcendent part in the spiritual practices that we discussed. So sometimes when our world gets very, very small, it's very good to start thinking about what is beyond the self. It's healing. It helps put life back into perspective. And you consider that bigness, other people, creation, gods. There's so many things that are beyond the self, right? So of course there are rituals in most traditions for worshiping God or gods, or worshiping aspects of nature as sacred. Or honoring particular places, such as sacred springs or mesas or trees or groves. For instance, we see this in Indian, Native American, shamanist, and Shinto religious traditions. Also, Wiccan and New Age practices have rituals focused on nature or on the energies of the natural world. Religions also have physical practices that externalize our thoughts, feelings, or desires, right? So this is also a getting out of the self. Sometimes when our minds are worried or resentful, or when it seems that we just keep on playing the same tapes of memories over and over, it can be very difficult. And sometimes physical actions help to externalize and mark what's going on in our heads or what's going on in our hearts. So religious traditions have these practices, like various offerings at shrines or temples, and many practices that honor the ancestors, including very physical things like having home altars, offering food offerings, engaging in parades or festivals that honor the dead and those who have passed. So we do something outward to represent what is going on inside of us. We mark important people or important events or losses in our lives. So many times, nobody knows what's going on with us, right? And sometimes it can be very important for us to do something to mark anniversaries or to mark our life experiences. So interestingly, there's lots of studies about this, that being involved in communal rituals might help individuals' mental health, if for no other reason than because positive emotions are associated with being a part of community, which is why religious rituals in community can have a strange, healing, soothing effect on us. Also, the predictability of the ritual can be a kind of containment for ourselves. And so participation in rituals can also, according to studies, influence mental health through the release of positive emotions, being together with others, sometimes to mourn, but also to celebrate. That gets us beyond the self. And celebration is so important to connect us back to the joy of life. So the spiritual seeker can also gain from these themes, even if they are not from a particular religious tradition. And so the question to ask yourself would be, what would a retreat look like for you? What would a nature walk do for your soul? Do you need to take a pilgrimage to a special or sacred place for you? What would that look like for you today? To be involved in connecting with transcendence in your life? Or what would a physical ritual look like for you? Now, something that involved stuff. It's really important that we involve stuff. We're so much in our heads, right? What about stuff? So something that might be helpful is the creation of an altar of some kind, or making a special meal, or planting a tree, engaging in a yearly memorial service, going to a sacred place in nature for meditation or prayer, or just to talk out how the year has been. So what things can you do with your bodies that might be helpful? So also, religious traditions have practices that involve guides or community. And I'm going to stop soon, so if you're getting bored, just wait for it, it's coming. So practices that involve guides or community. Guides who help us figure out for ourselves what is right and wrong, false, true or false, how we should live, how we find meaning, and also getting in touch with values and finding ways to practice them. That gets that third point in spirituality where we seek, well, actually, all of the points in spirituality, where we seek meaning, we seek to make meaning, and we also seek to live out a life philosophy and inform our lives to our values. So historic religions certainly have people who act as guides, who help someone connect to the transcendent or to meaning and values in their daily lives, whether it is seeking out a guru or a Sikh wise person, whether it is shamanistic religious practices, or whether it is priests or imam or rabbi. There are always people who act as guides. And this relates also to engaging in a life philosophy, to define values or ways of life ethically that help form a community. And so, of course, each of these historic religious traditions have sacred texts that help with that. The Vedas, the Bhagavad Gita, the Quran, the Talmud, the Christian scriptures. So these all also help. So if you're not from a religious tradition, this comes up to an interesting question. Are you able to take guidance from another? I think if you're here at this conference, the answer is yes, because you're seeking knowledge and you're seeking guidance and community. And so this is important. Can we seek guidance from another? And here's another question that can be hard if you're a caretaker. Are you able to ask for help? It is a spiritual discipline to be able to ask for help. It's a hard thing to do sometimes. So are we able to ask for help and get the help that we need? And here's another question for you. If you could name 3 things of ultimate value right now, what you live for, what would those 3 things be? And what are some things that you might want to let go of because they don't really match your 3 values? These are the kind of reflections that community can help us with, guides can help us with, and our own journaling or thoughts or prayers or meditations can help us with. So the final question would be, in community, how do you try to live out those values? NAMI is a great place to do it, right? But you also might find that there are people in your community who have similar experiences that you have. And as you well know from NAMI as an organization that reaches out into communities, you can certainly be an amazing support for others as well as you live out your values, if that happens to be one of your 3 values. So in sum, and then I hope you have a question or two, spiritual practices gather around these themes: self-examination and return, renewal and new beginnings, prayer and meditation practices, connecting with transcendence, physical actions, guides who help us, and getting in touch with values and finding ways to practice them. In all of these, we find not just a spiritual quest for our own life, but surprisingly, practices for emotional regulation, ways to help manage suffering, to center the self and its anxieties. So the spiritual quest is a lot about seeking a way of life. It also has a lot to do about improving our mental and emotional health right now. So I am going to attempt to bring you back. Hi, everybody. So I was wondering if you had any questions so far, and I think I have some. There's a couple. Okay. Grace has a question about the theme of the spiritual quest. It reminds me of the hero's journey. Yes, Joseph Campbell, right? Oh gosh, it's so long ago since I read that. But it is indeed a hero's journey to care for others or to experience our own conditions. Are there other interreligious approaches, books, authors regarding spirituality you would recommend for the spiritual journey? I have a bunch on a final slide. Some of them are interreligious and some of them are particularly religious if you wanted to kind of wend your way through different traditions. So I will show you that slide in a second, but also you can also email me and I can see if I can think of some others as well. Okay, Nethelia has a, oh, Peter has a question. Okay, yeah. Oh, inquiry investigation. Oh, I suppose quest and inquiry can be very, very useful. Hmm. Ah, yeah. So you're thinking about the spiritual mystic who refuses belief as a process to divine understanding, also the journey into discerning between true and false. Does that not depend on the development of critical inquiry? Yeah, absolutely. I would never advise anybody not to be critical and to engage in critical inquiry. And so it is very difficult to talk about spirituality, isn't it? Because sometimes it can seem very simple. But even if somebody is someone of strong faith in whatever their tradition is, yet our lives need to be full of critical inquiry, because uh, religious traditions can also, or their leaders can also be problematic. And it can be problematic for us to take what they say simply, especially if we come from the experience of having a mental health condition or supporting somebody who has one, because our experiences have to feed our spiritual quest. And so I think inquiry and investigation, absolutely. Um, the most uh, beautiful people I know are people who do wend their way through different traditions or no tradition at all, as they're continually questioning. And so, one thing I try to explain to my students, or try to encourage them to do, is to always take life experiences and the questions that it answers and throw it up to your beliefs and see what comes back down. And throw it up to your beliefs and see what comes back down. There's never a time when we should simply receive um, anybody's word about anything, but we should always be on a spiritual quest. I hope that helps a little bit, but I would definitely agree with you. So I'm definitely thinking of quest in a much broader sense, and I would agree. Diane has something too. Yes, the founder of the chapel, one of the founder of the chaplaincy movement, Anton Boysen, he has a book about his 1930s, I believe. He has a book, an autobiography about his experience. It's very moving. Um, and your mom is on hospice now. Yeah. Hospice chaplains are especially trained, and they're always either interfaith or no faith at all. There for you to help a loved one transfer over into the next reality, however you conceive of that. And also, more importantly, and isn't this the case for all of our sufferings? Also, most importantly, a chaplain should be able to help um, the family also have moments together of resolution, of discussion, of connection, sometimes of forgiveness, saying those things that they all need to say as they face death. So yes, absolutely. Guru Shada, how can a caregiver nudge a loved one recovering from mental illness to take up a spiritual journey? Oh my gosh, right? It is so difficult that we have. It is so difficult. I feel for you. Um, I don't know if your own spiritual journey helps your loved one to see the benefits. I am not sure. One of the things that we talk about in pastoral care training is trying to be with someone where they're at, and then also, as we have listened well, reflect back what we have heard, and then, and only then, to be able to say something like, that reminds me of this spiritual moment. That reminds me of a spiritual opening. Do you find something spiritual in what you have experienced? And so it is that kind of balance of opening someone up to be able to say, you are a deeply spiritual person, and your experiences are meaningful for you. But this can also be very difficult with loved ones, right? Because sometimes we are the last people they want to hear from. And so we definitely have to be careful about that, and be respectful in how we listen and reflect back before moving into meaning making. Cameron, in which an atheist who struggled through and recovered from severe depression or similar significant mental development. No, I have not. I have not. In recovery, I have experienced people who are atheists who come to their own understanding of a higher power. I have also found people who are on a spiritual quest come to Christianity as a chosen landing point. But it can also be difficult, and this is probably more for your psychiatrists who are on this conference than for myself. But it's also it can also be the case that spirituality is something that can be difficult to feel in depression. There's a sense of anhedonia. And so it can be very, very difficult to experience any kind of spiritual, life-giving spiritual feelings when one is depressed. But one thing that you might be able to do, Cameron, is help the person, if they have come to the other side, to reflect upon what life means for them now, and whether they find any kind of spiritual story within that. But it is a challenge. Oh my goodness. Okay. Great. Michael. Spiritual growth over time. Yes, beautiful. Yeah. I think you've done it for me, Michael. Could you talk about spiritual growth over time and how this can stretch someone and expand one's confidence and sense of purpose and increase one's potential? All of this increasing as one lives over time. Michael, you said it better than I could. And this is absolutely the case. And this was some challenge I felt in offering this presentation. Is because it's easy to say, oh, meditate. Oh, this is good for you. Pray, right? But people are in very different places in their spiritual development. It really is a process over time. And what's exciting about that is that if you're supporting somebody with a mental health condition, we can all admit that it's a process over time. There are times when we are angry at God or angry at the religion of our childhood. There are other times when we choose other paths. And there are other times when we choose to take from different kinds of traditions and form it into our own life experience and come out stronger at the end. And so I absolutely agree, growth over time. And as we work with people, I get anxious, and maybe you get anxious, especially about your loved ones, right? It is so important to remember that we are seeing them in this moment in time. We don't know what they'll be like in a year or 2 years or 3. Now, we know prognoses, we know, we know our history with people. It is something of a spiritual discipline not to relegate people to their histories. And to continue to believe that people change over time and deepen over time, just like we do. And so yes, Michael, you said it better than I could, but yet still I seem to manage to say a lot about it. But I appreciate your question very much. Grace. Are there particular dynamics in religious belief that tend to be harmful to mental health? Yes. Yes. Intrinsic is helpful. Extrinsic is usually not, although sometimes when one is sort of kind of going through the motions and then has a crisis, that might, again, over time, develop more of a faith tradition. But things that can make Christianity's mind, particularly. So, of course, I'm always talking to my seminarians about this, but this is true for most traditions. Things that can be difficult to make it negative are ideas of, well, frankly, this is my opinion, ideas of demonic possession, ideas of the evil eye. In Islamic faith, the ideas of jinn, which is another form of demonic possession. Sometimes people use these in ways that are very meaningful and kind of give power, like it's not me, it is a demon. And that's a meaning-making way that they come to strength. But other times, sometimes communities will push people out because they imagine they don't have enough faith, or they imagine that they are cursed in some way. And that's when communities can become not so helpful, right? So that is not helpful necessarily. The other aspects that make spirituality or religiosity helpful include pretty much everything that we've been talking about in terms of How can I get out of myself into something bigger than myself? And how can I ground myself? And all the practices that we've been talking about. And so I hope that they can be helpful as well. If you come from a certain faith tradition, there's usually healing prayer options in most faith traditions. There's also options of service and almsgiving in most faith traditions. There are ways when you find a loving community of any faith or no faith at all. They will usually find ways to help members who are having difficulties to find meaningful involvement in the community. And that's the best kind of community, whether it's religious or spiritual or just a gathering of friends and loved ones, right? Okay, so great. So I'm going to go to religious experiences for just a little bit of time. Oh, I'm running out of time. Okay, so we're gonna, oh, it ends at 8:50. I'm out of time. Okay, so I'm out of time. What I do want to suggest to you very briefly is, and I'll keep an eye on the time, is spiritual practices, meditation. These are extremely important in the faith, in various faiths, and extremely important in therapeutic practices right now. While I do that, I'm going to share my screen, and then I am going to see if I can email this to someone to share with you, uh, if it is too soon. I'm so sorry that. Here are some great books, at least that I think are great, and I can also share them with you. And so for the last few seconds, I want to suggest to you, especially meditation practices. You'll find a lot of them here on this reading list. When we're imagining meditation practices, what we're imagining is paying attention to the breath in and the breath out. Just doing that once relaxes me a little bit. The breath in and the breath out. We allow our thoughts and our feelings, but we try not to hold on to them. We thank them for coming, and then we return to our breath. And so it's that gentle return to the breath that's important. Breathing meditations really help to strengthen the parasympathetic nervous system. So there's a lot of studies that suggest breathing, mantra prayers, repeating prayers over and over again, meditation that focuses on the breath, loving kindness meditations, all of these kinds of meditations open our hearts, or open the heart chakra in the tradition, but also biologically calm down our parasympathetic nervous system. So in our autonomic nervous system, then we have the arousal, the anxiety side, the adrenaline side, and then we have the side that calms and centers and brings us more to peace. And so I would encourage you to consider those practices. For yourself. And you can also find many people who are involved in therapies that include mindfulness aspects, and also aspects of yoga as well as an embodied kind of practice. And so I would encourage you in those. I think that the session is over. But for those who want to remain, I just wanted to, I'll just say some concluding thoughts. Along with meditation, if you find difficulty concentrating with meditation, which I do, being an anxious person, I tend to walk and breathe, or walk and meditate. Or I tend to practice breathing while I'm driving in my car, because I have a hard time not doing something. And when I'm driving, then I can breathe and let go and tell myself nothing's happening except driving right now, and driving and breathing. And so practices of breathing, practices of sending out love and compassion, breathing in love and compassion and sending it back out, can be very, very powerful centering rituals for us and for those we love. And so also can be walking meditations and mantra prayers. Also consider, please, the rituals. If you're still online with me 1 minute after, do consider rituals. You experience in your body the anniversaries of your losses. And you experience in your body anniversaries of traumatic times. And if you support somebody with mental health conditions, you may have some moments of grief that you remember very clearly. Can you find rituals around those times? Whether it's simple things like lighting a candle and saying a prayer, or something bigger like using that day to volunteer, or that day to plant a tree, or that day to gather with friends and remember and share a meal together. So think about how you can mark time with rituals, times that are meaningful for you. And so those were some things that I hope that you consider. The prayer, the breath, and also ritual making for you and for your anniversaries and for meaningful times in your life. So I hope that was helpful. My time is up, and I imagine you all are tired. So I think I'm going to stop the broadcast. I know that Peter had one more question. Nathila Peter had one more question. Storytelling, yes. If you're still on, I'm telling you, it's wonderful. Storytelling is also a big part of narrative therapy and a big part of therapy, which we all should enjoy and be in. But storytelling can connect our pain to the amazing stories of the faith. We're part of something much bigger than ourselves. So thank you. Good night. Be good to yourself.